welcome everyone who's dialing in now. We are pleased to see you here on this Emerging Payments Association Asia webinar, hot topic briefing. We haven't had one for a while, but we do promise there will be a lot more next year again. I think we got lost in the joy of actually seeing people in person. So we used to have hot topic briefings monthly, and always picking up on some kind of discussion that was out there in the industry that we thought it would be beneficial for you to hear from experts. So with that, I'm super pleased to today talk about the findings from SIBOS, which happened not last week, the week before. I think all of you who weren't there probably felt like like me. It was really that fear of missing out. It was a fact. Everything was happening many hours away. So thank you for joining us here today. So most of you do recognize me by now. I'm Camilla Bullock, and I have the joy of leading the Emerging Payments Association Asia. And we are the leading branch organization in the APAC region, focusing on policy and advocacy, but out of that, thought leadership is born. So we'll touch a little bit of all kind of topics in this session today. And I'm very pleased to have one of our members here today. We have Shirish Vadivakar, the MD, Global Head of Wholesale Payments and Trade Strategy at Swift. Hello, Shirish. How are you today?
Very good. Thank you for inviting me, Camilla.
Fantastic. And I'm going to add also that Shirish used to be the Director, Global Head of Payments at Standard Chartered. You were with Standard Chartered, I think, 19 years. And I think that is important in the discussion always to know actually where people are coming from and putting it into context when we're talking about this exciting value chain of payments. And also, I have Dr. Brad Pragnell with me. Brad is working in my team here at EPA as the policy lead. And Brad, you're a man of many trades. You haven't been 19 years with one organization.
No.
Where you are now, and then we'll kick off.
Yeah, thanks, Camilla. So helping out EPA on their payments policy work, and independent consultant. Before that, I was, and I've been working primarily in the area of real time. And before that, I was head of policy at AusPayNet. So that's sort of been my background. So about 15 years in payments now.
And then we found you, and we're very pleased about that. So thank you very much. And we're going to start this actually not with what was discussed, or I would actually say it was probably one of the most discussed announcement at SIBOS. So Shirish, Swift and Wise in partnership. This is one of the themes that I've been talking over the last 2 weeks and picking people's brain on. So let's hear it from, I was going to say the horse's mouth, but I don't know if that's a nice thing to say. So Shirish, give us your version. What happened actually there?
So right to the bone, is it? So actually, let me tell you, it was not just the Wise announcement. There were many. We also had a Visa announcement with Visa B2B in a similar vein. So yes, the Wise got a little more press because it was slightly more controversial for the press guys. But if you look at it from how we see it at Swift, I think both Wise and Visa have been clients. They are on the network. They're supervised entities. They are actively selling their services to banks who are also clients on Swift. So the idea actually was the fact that these offerings from Wise, Visa, and more are actually creating optionality for our banks to make payments into different places. So this is the thematic that we're trying to look at, is that how do we help banks reuse investments in Swift, the infrastructure that they've invested in, the security, the identity, the safety, the traceability of payments, the GPI conversation that we have. How do we use that, and how do we reuse that actually to help save costs and help make the investment ROI better for our banks, to provide them the optionality to connect to other networks? So the question is, our clients, the bank's clients, which are demanding such services. We as a network are neutral. We are a neutral network. So we want to make sure that we can offer optionality to connect to more networks. Wise Visa is just an example, and we'll do more of that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I definitely like those words, optionality, and it's almost coming back to the horses for courses, depending on what payments we're sending and what corridors we're interested in. But Brad, going to turn to you. Actually, what do you think? What was your reaction, and what was the attendees' reaction? Was this talked about?
Oh, look, the WISE announcement definitely received quite a bit of attention. So people were very surprised, I think, who weren't aware of it. They did see WISE as a bit of a competitor, a competing network to Swift. So I think that they found it interesting. And I think on one hand, it gave WISE even further credibility in the eyes of many in the market. So, I think Wise, previously TransferWise, was always seen as a bit of a scrappy fintech. I know that there were some in the industry who, think, well, they're not going to survive, they're not going to flourish, they're et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, in some ways, I think this was Wise's graduation into the being considered a very serious player in the world of cross-border payments. So I think this collaboration has demonstrated that Wise has done an incredible job of building their business to the point where they are collaborating with some of the most well-established and biggest organizations in the world. So I think that's a huge kudos to Wise, and yeah, I think some exciting things ahead on that front.
I think it's also gets remit to that. We talked a lot about last year going and we had the discussion about the alternative rails, but very often we came down to complementary rails. And I think that's
Yeah.
really what we're saying here, that depending on where we are and when.
Hmm.
But this was not going to be a webinar. But yeah, Shirish, please
But
add.
to add, to add, I think it's the customer that drives choice, right? So it is not necessarily just the banks or the networks. It is the customer who is trying to make payments, whether it is the wholesale customer or a retail customer. So I think the customer and the commerce, the speed of commerce that is expected now, is driving those demands on banks and providers. I think that is what we need to see. What is the underlying demand, and that is what we need to respond to. So whether we respond by say Swift Go, which is our own ability to make sure low value payments go cheaper, faster, and in a much more cost effective manner, or whether they want to connect to third parties like these networks. What we want to ensure in Swift is while we provide that optionality, and this is very important, I want to underscore this, that while we do provide optionality and we want to provide optionality, it should not reduce the quality of the payments in the network. So it should be technically opaque to the actual consumer of the payment, whether the payment starts on the Swift, ends somewhere else. So when we talk to these partners, these players, we are expecting them to also track and update Swift network on the payment so that the GPI promise of traceability, and visibility and transparency is not lost. So it is not just connect and forget; it is connect and track.
Yeah, I think we'll come back to that. I have a few more questions around actually that different stage on the journey. I is actually going to do a call out to the audience. Please pop your questions in the chat or the Q&A. I prefer the chat actually, if you want to, because then I can see them all very quickly there, and I'll tie it in. And we're also open for some questions later on. But let's dive into actually the conference topics. So first, if you would choose one takeaway, one that I often call about sentiment words. When I do presentation, I call out 3 sentiment words of the quarter. This was 4 days. What was those sentiment words? And we start with one, yes. And I don't know. And who wants to go first?
I'm happy to jump in. Sorry, Go ahead.
Then I said, guest, you were the guest. I'm the host, so go ahead.
Thank you. Look, I think the tagline for this year's Swift was actually very apt. It was really identifying 2 things. One was around the notion of collaboration, and I do think that collaboration is critical. I mean, we had the Wise announcement, we had the Visa announcement, and there was also a lot of discussion around the notion of network of networks. And there was a lot of discussion around that in the back. It's around that we're not going to have a world of a single network allowing us to transmit payments, and around how do we connect those networks in a way and as Shirish was saying, how do we use tracking? How do we use standards? How do we use other tools to allow us to do things and maintain the high level of quality in terms of that managing risks and meeting all the other targets and expectations. So I think there was a strong sense around collaboration. The other part of the tagline for SIBOS was really around an uncertain world. So I think a lot of uncertainty out there at the moment. I mean, we've got SIBOS back in person, which is very good. So I think we did get that sense of everyone being back in the room again, and I think it was really inspirational. And I think people found the really positive being back in person again. But then we think about the past couple of years and what we've had to go through. We've had to go through COVID. We've had to go through the situation between Russia and Ukraine. We've had to go through a lot of really challenging concerns and the role of regulators. So the role of regulators and national governments sort of pushing and pulling the industry seemed to be a lot of the chatter that was going on that I found in the conference room. So a lot of concern that, while the industry was doing a very good job of collaborating and working together, that regulators and policymakers, governments were actually doing the exact opposite. That they were actually, pushing ahead on things like data localization, that they were looking at creating national networks. They were looking at ways of basically trying to make it harder to do things in a cross-border sense. So, there's a lot of those differing trends that were going on there. And then there's a general sentiment around the economy, I think, as well. We're at a little bit of an inflection point where people are concerned around the global economic context. There are concerns around a recession and a global recession, and what does that mean going forward in terms of the level of investment and in terms of growth and profitability. So there was a lot of mixed messages there, a lot of not messages, but a lot of mixed emotions going on, I would say, at SIBOS. So, the storm clouds on the horizon, are they gonna build, or are they gonna dissipate? Are we going to see this brave new world of AI and ESG and the industry working collaboratively, or are the storm clouds of national governments sort of pushing their agendas, regulators pushing their agendas, going to start breaking things apart?
Is to stop you there. You're covering all the topics at once, and I need to dive in.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's good. It's good, Brad. We'll come back to them. Calling out those the collaboration.
My job easy.
The economy sentiment, very interesting, because when I came back from the Global FinTech Fest in Mumbai, which had also like closer to 80,000 people, it was not a big theme. It was a very, very upbeat atmosphere. Very little talking about those there, actually. But those were the things. We'll come back to them soon and also talk more about the interoperability and networks of networks. Shirish, did he leave any topics to you that you think stood out?
I think Brad did cover a lot, and I think that was good. There's a good coverage of topics. I will just give really good nuances. So, if you look at collaboration, that's been constant thematic at SIBOS for the past 5 SIBOSes, virtual or otherwise. Because if you really look at it, and I say this very often, that trade and payments, they are the most collaborative problems we have of our generation to solve for. Because our commerce and prosperity and everything else that is dragging us down, so the economic slowdown or problems in geopolitics and so forth. I think what will keep the world turning is making sure that commerce and participation in commerce and making that commerce instant and frictionless will continue. So I want to add that nuance that at Swift we consider collaborative finance in a fragmented world, which is the thematic of this SIBOS, as a continuing theme for us. It's not just once and done. That's one. Second, I think what I want to add is that I would look at SIBOS in 2 halves, now and new. So there's a lot of now that we have to also do, which is basically ISO adoption, taking standards, fragmentation. So these thematics have to get their own spotlight. And yes, there is new. So the new is creates hopes, it creates potential, it creates drive. So AI is there. CBDCs are still around and discussed vigorously. I see a question on that in our chat. So I think there is a lot to balance between the now and the new. But when I see a lot of new things, I think there's a lot of hope in the industry. There's a lot of people trying to solve it. I'm not questioning or verifying whether a particular solution is better or another, but the fact that people are solving for the question asked, how do you collaborate in a fragmented world? I think that is what I would take from SIBOS.
That's actually interesting. I'm going to add on to that, because so if we say that those were the most talked about, because I mean, I have on the bottom of my list, I don't think we'll get there, what was said about Gen AI, because it's talked about everywhere. But if we say, what do you think was the most urgent issue, the one that you felt like we have to solve this now, would that be getting return on the transit into ISO 20022, or is it anything else that says, now we have to do this over the next 12 months, we need to have another story at SIBOS in China?
It's a good question. I'll try to take it, and then probably Brad, see if you have a different view. If there's one thing, and probably I'm slightly self-serving, I think ISO. I'll tell you why, and it's slightly unsexy to talk about ISO, but everything we're talking about in the future about building, even Gen AI, all of this requires structured data or more data. So if you were to build the future of intuitive finance or embedded finance or context-aware payments, which I love that word. I'm trying to think about how do we create context-aware payments. All of that is possible if you actually have the data in place. So that foundation of ISO 20022 cannot be ignored, because you can't build based on a very limited, unstructured data set of future of tomorrow's payments. So I would say that there is a cause and effect. I would stick on the fact that make sure that the ISO adoption. And today we're doing a bank-to-bank conversation at Swift, but it has to go further. The data, the real payments, the data source actually is the people who send and receive payments, not the banks who exchange the payments. So I think the question is, how do you shift left? How do you take that standards, that data harmonization left to the originator of the payment?
Yep.
I don't know, Brad, would you agree, disagree?
Yeah. No, I'd agree with you there. I think the ISO question, I think around structuring and validating data is really at the heart of a lot of the discussions at SIBOS. And to what degree can we do structured data? Can we do the validation of that data in a way that satisfies both customers and regulators in terms of ensuring the accuracy of what we're sending over those networks? So I think a lot of that is, kind of the core of a lot of the discussion. And it feels like we're in this race between trying to get those structured, that work done around structuring and validation, competing against sort of these headwinds of cyber, of fraud, of regulators, of all these other things that we're trying to deal with at the same time.
Yeah, it resonates with a lot of discussions we had, and I think it's a global phenomenon. We have to solve it everywhere, but it looks a little bit different in each location. But an ask that we often get is to take that new value out of ISO 20022 and apply it. What problems does it solve? And Shari's coming to you, shifting left, or we're saying sometimes there is a dissonance about how we talk about payments and how corporate sees payments, because corporates rather don't see it. But how do we shift that to actually have a value add conversation? What could happen with the data? Perfect. Thank you very much. A little bit of themes there. So I'm just going to go in and focus a little bit on few words that I picked up on sitting at home and seeing all posts coming and hashtags here and hashtags there and thinking, this is the question I want to ask. So one word coming up all the time was interoperability. And here I want to ask, is the question or the discussion, does it sound different over there in the West compared how it is here, where we see the interlinkages taking shape? And what would you say? What was the discussions around interoperability? I'll come to both of you of this one, actually. So Sharice, I'll let you go first again, because Brad just takes all the topics. And
so I think interoperability for Swift, I would call it the beating heart of Swift, because over time we've been connecting payment networks to CLS, connecting to T2S securities network. So for us, interoperability is as good as what we do day in, day out. But the difference between how the say ASEAN work in interoperability versus what is happening in the other part of the world. I think the difference is actually twofold. One is a technology-led difference, because I think it is not just standards where part of the world is focused on standards and interoperability. I think in Asia there have been live examples of trying to make networks talk to each other and see what you learn from them. So there's an advancement of learning that happens in Asia because of the fact that we have networks live. Forget how successful they are or not, that's not the discussion. The experience of connecting two networks itself is critical. I tell you why. It's not the standards, it's about the legal interoperability frameworks. The words that we typically don't talk about interoperability is the non-technological interoperability, and that is the difference what's happening in our discussions at SIBOS. Because I think over time people have realized technology anybody can do it. Technology can make it possible. The question is, can we solve finality of the payment? Can we solve title transfer? Can we solve the need for documentation or not need for documentation? So interoperability actually has now become a little more mature, and from technological interoperability to the non-technical interoperability. And then it is a wider ecosystem. It is the governments, it's the vendors, it is the banks, it is the networks itself. So I don't think this is a one-person solve anymore, just from standards perspective. So interoperability has become lighter. And this is all the thematic that we will talk about, network of networks, or how we call it network optionality. They all sit in the same, bucket.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Brad, I'm just going to add a little layer. So when I hear you answer, is that because you have that deep insight, especially working on the payment strategy in Canada, and then the work you're doing with us in the region. So layer, if you can just shift that, what do you find is the difference, and who do you think actually is leading here? Is it the technology route? Is it the standard route? And who has the most obstacles on the route? Now, I give you lots of time for that one because there's a lot of questions.
No, look, I think what I came away from with SIBOS was a greater appreciation around the role that governments, policymakers, and central banks are very active participants in the Asia Pacific region. They're working very collaboratively and closely with each other and with industry in terms of trying to solve these problems. They're active participants. I feel that when you come to Europe and to North America, it's more, we want you to solve these problems, industry, now go fix it, right? There's less of that active engagement that's happening. And I think that's making it difficult in some of these jurisdictions for things to get done, because different industry players have different levels of technological sophistication, they have different commercial models, they have different capability and capacity. And without someone being prepared to step in and really, provide leadership and drive direction, it doesn't always have to be a central bank or a Ministry of Finance. It could be an industry body, it could be, a lot of other private or public entities. You're kind of lacking that leadership in some of these other jurisdictions, where I think in the Asia Pacific, I think we've got some strong bodies who are providing a level of leadership on this issue and direction. I think that's helping us solve some of these problems a bit more efficiently.
Yeah, it definitely will be an interesting year to see what happens, and coming even down to that, what you pointed at before, the stability, political stability, what will happen there, because it's some of those political issues that need to be solved to get this to run smoothly. But I'm going to go to this. Yes,
just to add, there was a very interesting session at SIBOS, and I think it will come on playback for many of you. There was a discussion between a regulator and a fellow from the Brookings Institute, asking what is the role of a regulator? Does the regulator, can it have a role apart from, can it also do a payment operator? There's a very good discussion whether regulator should be focused on monetary policy and leave the payment operations and a payment operator or payment creation to somebody else. And the discussion was between a US-based person and Reserve Bank of India, where Reserve Bank of India operates the largest payment network like NPCI, which had 10 billion transactions last month. So it was a very interesting conversation. I don't want to give it away, but I think if people have time, I think that's a good conversation to double click on and to see. And because Brad's point is very valid, regulators played a very different role here versus the rest of the world.
Yeah, they can always go down also to that. I had a discussion recently about even if it is who owns the system, like who is the provider behind the system ultimately, and where are they taking it into the future. But I think that is a very good segue, and I'm going to bump up the CBDC question so that we cover that for Satish. So we're talking about technology might solve this, or is it standards? So what is actually CBDCs? Is it technology or is it standards? That's something that I'm asking myself.
Do you want to go first, Brad?
Yeah, I can go first on that. Look, actually, I would say that the CBDC debate at SIBOS was a little bit muted this year compared to previous years. I think there was more focus on other topics, cross-border payments, interlinkages, G20, embedded finance, generative AI, ESG. So I think there was a little bit of wait and see within the industry around CBDCs. I mean, there's so many pilots and out there that are happening at the moment, and I think there's a bit of a wait and see to see where central banks land on this. So um, I don't think people are saying it's past, but I think people are taking a little bit of a wait and see. I mean, I'm not actually answering your question, but I think we're in a little bit of a lull around CBDCs. There could be another. I wouldn't be surprised that when we get to Beijing in 2024, that CBDCs are going to be again top of the pops at SIBOS in terms of a discussion topic, because I think we're going to see either a number of governments making some very big announcements around this, or else it's just going to be something that we learn from and then we think about it down the road. So I think we're kind of at a little bit of a next 12 months will be very interesting in terms of CBDCs.
So that's good, Brad. I appreciate that perspective. Let's look at the question, and the question says, what is the promise of CBDC? So what was the promise that people are going after, and what was the promise that led towards experimentation? I think various governments came from different aspects of this conversation. There were some people who were looking at replacement of physical currency because the physical currency is costly, printing, damages, and all of that. So that is probably the Nordics and some of the very highly digitized countries in the world focused there. Some of the countries wanted to respond to the FOMO of actual cryptocurrency destabilizing monetary policy in a country, right? So cryptocurrency, if it really grew as it grew and it became mainstream, it actually is not yet, but it could have destabilized monetary policy. So there was a need to understand from a government point of view, how do we respond to this challenge? That challenge response was technical, more technological, to understand whether if we were to create our own stablecoin / CBDC, how that look like. Answer is somewhere in the middle. We'll find an answer eventually. And to Brad's point, I see it's slightly, people are becoming a little more grounded. I think it's a good thing because the experiment euphoria is now passing into a use case demand. What is the use case? What the promise of the CBDC, the original promise that Satish asked, was programmability currency, getting rid of reconciliation, making sure that the RTGS in a country works better. So I would see CBDCs as a natural progression of RTGSs. That's my personal view. However, I think from as Swift we see it, we don't have a particular say in this conversation. We ferry data and we ferry currencies. So if the currencies become mainstream, we currency of the supply chain, we'll ferry it. But I think the question is very valid, and I think thanks Satish for asking the question, because we need to think about what was the promise that we're going after. So now in this time that we are in, we've gone past the euphoria, the hype curve is into more steady state. That's when we need to find out the use cases. Is it retail? Is it wholesale? Is it cross-border? Is it settlement only? I think that will determine how the next 12, 24 months of announcements will be by banks, regulators, and the community together for CBDCs. I would say that the maturity is good.
So Shirish, what was your highlight of SIBOS?
I think I would. There was a point that Camila asked this question earlier also. I was going to say that a surprising moment for me was because I was not prepared for the level of openness or people had this thinking of art of the possible on sharing data, because data sharing is quite a complicated conversation. It rubs against regulation, it rubs against customer privacy, it rubs against a lot of things, jurisdictions and geofencing of data. But I saw a lot more willingness to, or at least discussions in the art of the possible, that how do we really use data across the platform that get generated, whether it's on Swift, whether it's on networks, whether it's banks. I think that was very surprising. Not surprising, it was very encouraging to hear that conversation.
Yeah.
So what do you think? What was your aha moment, if there was one?
My aha moment, I think, was I sat in one of the G20 cross, and I see there's some questions around the G20 projects here from Danelle, so I might answer them. Yeah, I might just think about that. I think for me, I was sitting in one of the G20 sessions, and we were talking about the G20 cross-border payment targets for 2027. And there was a survey question around the achievability of those targets. And I think generally there was a sense from the respondees that cost is the hardest issue. That we can solve transparency, we can solve access, we can even solve all of those other issues, but cost is going to remain a tough ask. And the 1% target for retail payments for 2027 is something that I think a number of people feel is difficult. And it's not just difficult because it's difficult for a variety of reasons. It's difficult because of regulatory issues. It's difficult because of so many other costs involved. Exactly. So many other people touching the payment, just the complexity, the counterparties involved, the risk management involved, everything, and being able to really bring down the overall cost, for all payments, regardless of the corridor, right? Again, some corridors are going to be more expensive than other corridors. I think there was a lot of concern around that and around the how realistic that target was. So there seemed to be a lot of discussion around that we're going to do well on, and I'm just picking up on the chat, that we're doing really well on speed. I think, Shirish, I saw one session said 89% of payments are going through in an hour, right? I mean, that's a great number. And I think Swift really needs to be congratulated on really dealing with the speed issue. Access is being dealt with and transparency is being dealt with, particularly through prepayment validation. I think cost is going to continue to remain the challenging issue.
Somebody told me that they felt that the conversation have shifted from being about instant payments to faster payments, and that is more questioning around instant payments. And I'm just curious about that, because I love the conversation around instant payments and what that could do for GDP and for smaller businesses. Is that anything you heard?
Actually, I would discount that a little bit, because Brad said that thank you for congratulating Swift, but actually, Brad, all the congratulations go to the banks, because they actually moved from batch processing to stateful processing, make sure that the traceability, transparency was transferred, and we could actually track the payment end to end. A lot of work went into GPI. So GPI is one of those innovations at scale that we were very, very happy for the industry came together and delivered it. On instant, I think, Camilla, the problem is not on the side of whether it's gone off and it's become. I'm saying there were two tracks. We were trying to look at instant from a point of the fact that there are a lot of these domestic, local instant payment schemes. Could we connect them across? That was the interoperability challenge there. It wasn't a speed challenge as much. The speed challenge is actually always in flight. It is about ability to make sure payment leaves, sanction screening happens in time. So the instant challenge actually is more interoperability challenge, and that's where not too many instant schemes across the world allow one leg out payments, basically allow payments internationally cleared on them. I think that is the education we need to focus on. We need to understand whether the regulators want to look at those schemes to allow, for example, fast in Singapore is still gray on whether you can actually use this for international settlement of Sing dollars. Australia MPP is going to launch that scheme, I think, next year. UK Fast already has it, but the US RTP and all of these things are still not open for cross-border on a legal basis or on a technical basis. So I think that is slowing down the instant conversation, not speed or connectivity. That's my view, Brad.
Look, I would totally agree with you on that. I think that's a very good. I think as we work through connecting these systems. And I think there's a lot of good discussion around interlinkages and how we can affect that different systems are at different levels of sophistication and the ability to actually follow through. And also I think the perception of their participant community in terms of the potential value of that and the additional cost involved in upgrading their systems or their capability, and to what degree they're going to benefit from it going from just a domestic system to also facilitating cross-border. So there was quite a bit of discussion around that. I would agree with you on that. I think going back to the speed issue, Camilla, I would agree. I think that the issue around instant has kind of become a little bit less important than the issue of fast. I think now that we're starting to see that, and I agree with Sharice. I think GPI, and I can remember some of the early announcements around GPI and SIBOS, going back 7-8 years ago. Some of it was like, yeah, it's just a bunch of standards and, some SLAs, and it's not really gonna, I don't want to say not going to be impactful, but I think some people were questioning its impact. But I think now people are saying, yeah, GPI has made a real impact. GPI has actually been highly impactful in terms of just moving the entire ecosystem forward. So it sort of, again, shows to me the challenge and the benefit of sometimes these initiatives take a couple of years to have an effect. But when they do, even things that might just seem, more standards-based or more just sort of actually can be very impactful, right? It just takes a little bit of time for that to flow through.
Like
so
all
I think
change, right?
GPI.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Exactly.
like all changes, slow it initially, and then suddenly it happens all suddenly. Brad, I want to answer some of the challenges you really pointed out on the cost of payments. I know the cost is the real challenge, and I understand it. But I think again, I would go back to the spirit of collaboration and data sharing,
Yep.
and talk about
Yes.
pre-validation in that spirit. One of the questions Camilla had put in the chat was about pre-validation. I think pre-validation is a one way of reducing cost of payment. It is not the marginal cost you're worried about, but it is the overall cost of errors. So it's like we all say, prevention is better than cure. Pre-validation is just that. If I can prevent payment errors from happening, anecdotal figures between 5 to 7% payments across the world today get rejected or undelivered because of data errors in account numbers. Just that. Forget the name matching.
Yeah.
So if you even get the account numbers right, pre-validate them, accounts are valid. So I think pre-validation is one way we can help contribute back to that 1% retail payment goal that has been put in by the G20, and the 5% or 2-3% wholesale payment goal that has been put in. So I think pre-validation has a space, and it actually imbibes the collaborative aspect, the data sharing aspect, as well as a use case to make sure that we deliver on cost.
Yeah. So I can jump in there. One of the numbers that jumped out at me, though, you mentioned the 5% fail. I went to one of the prepayment validation sessions, and they said that that's costing the industry somewhere in the vicinity of 2 billion euros a year. So that's real money, right? That's real money on the table. So as the industry solves some of these problems.
Yeah, if the payment is going to a currency control or an exchange control location, getting it back, you'll actually end up losing the value of the payment drastically. So the 2 billion number is not fiction. It actually is very, very imaginably real.
Yeah. So we've done quite a few discussions on this, and more will definitely come, because it has that I was going to say dollar value. It has that monetary value on it, which makes it really interesting. But it's also actually who we're talking about, which is like, you need everybody to join here, because if somebody's data is not good, that's just going to the problem is still in the chain. And what we hear is often, but we are a small bank, we can't take that infrastructure cost. We rather pay that person, and you have that operational workaround. So definitely one to revisit. And I think it's very important in our region to have everybody in the room when we're talking about it. But another thing that is actually everywhere when we're talking about this is, of course, data. And I think we heard less about open data in this SIBOS than in the previously 10. I might not be right here, but what did you hear about open data? What was the discussion? Well, is the European PSD3 is coming? What did the Asian participants talk about this? Any sentiments on the topic of open data?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think, Brad, I don't know how you see it, but I think the location influenced this because if we were at Amsterdam, we were still discussing open banking last year in SIBOS. I think I think the location and the fact that we have more American and Latin American people and even Asian participants than the location influences these things, right?
Yeah.
So I think it wasn't discussed to that extent that would have made an impact. But I think but if you look at how other countries tackled open banking, without PSD2, there are infrastructures who are completely API stack. So Singapore has an API stack they're developing. India has one for a long time, and many Aussie. And a lot of these places, the API stack replaces the open banking need for a regulatory open banking like PSD2. So open banking to deliver what it's supposed to do to improve the way the customers connect or processes connect with banking processes exists. But it was more. There was a question also that came in from Vikas Rajpal about how vendors are getting involved in the conversation. So APIs have been discussed more often than open banking in SIBOS this time. And to Vikas's question, yes, we are involving vendors and everybody in the chain, because we know that it is not going to be one person changing the net, or Swift alone can't do it, a bank alone can't do it. But I think the buzzword is now back to APIs than just open banking. But I don't know, Brad, what you think?
Yeah, look, I think you're right. I think there was a much more discussion around about the API stack and about the benefits of APIs around industry solving a lot of these problems. And yeah, I think there is location impact as well too. I mean, open banking has moved at a snail's pace in Canada, which was a host country. Less, not really getting a lot of traction there. Industry is looking at it, but I think, I would agree with you. I think looking at it more from an industry-led API stack kind of perspective, I think that's kind of really where that conversation is going now. So let's see what happens. Like, I think it's going to be very interesting when we go back again. I think Beijing in 2024 for SIBOS is going to be very interesting to see how that impacts the next level of discussions.
Both of you are talking to something that has been a theory of mine for a while. That thing, it is actually the terminology that sort of we're using. It's not the discussion that stopped. It's just we're just not using the terminology in the same ways that we did, because the data that will not go away. And coming back to the importance of trade. Yeah. I think it's very important to shift into, when we're talking, this is not the topic for this webinar, but we have all the free trade agreements about fostering trade, but payments as a service is not part of it. The data is not part of those discussions, and that is often like bottlenecks around trade. But totally different topic, but one that's close to heart, as I come from a data background. Tokenization. That is another buzzword that I heard at SIBOS, and tokenization probably around data more than tokenization as in a crypto world. Did you hear this word, and what and where was it used?
Look, a little bit. I did pick that up a bit. That in terms of tokenization. Look, again, I think quite often people are seeing this as part of a wider strategy in terms of thinking about how they can apply new technologies to solve problems. So I think what I was picking up was a lot of the discussions around tokenization. We're intersecting with conversations around embedded finance and AI, and looking at things in terms of cryptography and security. And really about how people can bring together a variety of different tools to do a better job at managing risk. So, and that was a strong theme for me during SIBOS as well too, was that there was a strong undercurrent in terms of the prevalence of fraud, of cybersecurity issuations, even increasingly we're seeing activity involving sort of state actors as well. and how can the industry use some of these tools to combat and to address some of those issues. And I think that was really where I was getting quite a bit of the tokenization conversation for me.
Therese, anything you want to add?
I would echo that. I would echo that. I think tokenization, if you look at the industry that is looking at it, in most fervor is the securities industry, and they see this as a disintermediation of the traditional. So they moved from paper scripts to DMAT, now from DMAT to tokenization. The promise there again is very similar to the technology promise, which is can be individual data, single source of record, zero recon requirements, faster transfer of securities, the drive to the industry to the T or T+1 securities goal. Tokenization is seen as a means to solve that problem. So technology is an answer to a problem. I would go back to the question. The tokenization is used to solve for faster securities movement. There is also some very new work, and as I covered trade also in Swift, there's some work happening around how do we tokenize trade assets, and because of the fact that trade needs more distribution power to make sure that people can participate in creating capital for trade finance. That's another way of using trade assets. So very initial conversations that started this SIBOS and earlier. So watch this space. I would say it's again back to Brad's point. A technology to solve a problem. Let's focus on the problem first.
Yep. Thank you for that. Some more to come on that topic. This one is for you, Brad, probably because it's something that we are picking up and kicking off our project now around passporting of licenses. I know this has been a hot topic in Europe before. Did you hear what's the latest and any trends? And did you hear it from an APAC perspective?
Look, I think the conversation is still pretty mute. It was pretty quiet around the passporting of licenses. I think there's a recognition that governments are moving forward on PSP licensing in a number of jurisdictions. And I think there was a real hope from the SWIFT community broadly and from the attendees that regulators would do a better job of working together to allow for licensed entities to be able to operate in different jurisdictions and not have to, be duplicative. And I think that quite often came up in the conversation around cross-border payments. So that, again, going back to that cost concern, right, that a lot of the costs involved with cross-border payments, I think I agree with Shirish. I think there was kind of two things. One was around, risk management, operational inefficiencies, reworking, data not actually solving the problem, like problems with the data. And then on the other side, there was around the regulatory burden or the frictions created by regulation. So, if we can solve those two issues, then I really do think that that's going to be part of solving that problem. So I do think that it goes back to industry on standards and on standardization and on doing things collaboratively, and then hopefully working across to regulators and getting them to work more collaboratively together as well. I mean, it got even raised. I attended the BIS PI meeting task force, and even though they're focusing more on interoperability and standards issues, the issues around the need for regulators to collaborate was raised once again. So again, we want that to be something that regulators, they can't just make it an industry problem. They have to sort of look at themselves, and they need to be prepared to work together as well if they're going to bring those costs down.
Good, thank you. So one that it is important to shed light on this to lower the cost, and I think we're going to look really of where to start in that conversation. So more to come, and Brad, you will be that discussion. Sure, it's maybe not in the hottest of the topics that you focus on, but we'll let you know what conclusions we come to. Maybe also not one of your focus areas, Shirish, but one that I would love to hear good stories on. And I think, I hope not saying too much, that we haven't actually had the meaty stories around it. Was it anything meaty specific around ESG? How did that come up?
So not necessarily. I don't know how you see meaty, but I think E is pretty well understood, and there's a lot of work happening there. We also had a small announcement in SIBOS where we connected to a fintech that is providing scoring for companies on their for e-score for lending and so forth. ESG thematic continues. I would still go back a little more on data, because ESG on its own is not a standard yet. So we need a standard for ESG. For us to get to that point, first the data set has to be standardized. And I think there I should call out to my friends in the ICC, who do a lot of good work in trying to standardize that portion of data that is included in trade and payment. So I think ESG will, in my mind, will be led by trade, because it impacts supply chains and it implies employment creation. That's the S portion, and it implies the way the government should interact in that supply chain, create inclusion, create abilities for commerce to be widened out in the economy and not just limited a few. So I think trade will have a bigger drive to create a stronger ESG agenda than just payments. Because honestly, if you really look at it, payments are at the end of a trade. The trade has to happen first, and the payments come after that.
Right.
So in my mind, I think it is a trade. We'll see this as a much bigger push. And a shout out to my friends at BAFT and ICC who are actually starting work on trying to define standards on this space. And SWIFT is joining those conversations in full furor.
Yeah, and sometimes discussion is almost shifted around that G should almost come first, but it's hard, because it's very hard to measure those things. And there are champions out there that does so good things, but it's very hard to put the name on it. But still, we need the name and the use cases to inspire others. It's definitely one that we keep on looking out for, because we want to hear them. It's good for all of us. So I have one more question, and then just a theme of what you would like to see. We can't leave this without talking about Gen AI. So where did it come up? What was it any new themes? And again, was it a difference how it's talked about globally and in our region?
I'll jump in first here on the Gen AI. Look, I think most people recognize that we're pretty early in this conversation and in terms of working out its applications. So that seemed to be a pretty common theme in a few of the Gen AI sessions that I attended. People were looking at it in terms of enhancing operational efficiencies, in terms of risk management, in terms of the customer experience. So, that's really some of the applications that we're looking for, but it's still very early days. Again, I didn't discern any sort of regional differences around the Gen AI discussion. I think that it's still, because it's still pretty early on, I don't think we've seen different approaches quite yet, but yeah, quite a bit of interest. And I do think the sessions that I did go to where it felt the most impactful were really around addressing risk issues and addressing issues around fraud and cybersecurity and so forth. So I really do think that could be where it could have the biggest impact, I would hope, because I think there was a common concern that industry really needs to put a lot of effort into solving those issues.
I'll echo that. I'll try and connect the themes back to the original conversation, right? I talked about people having willingness to share data. I think that it starts from that point, that is a good willingness. And I think in areas that are non-competitive, definitely that feeling is higher. So fraud management, anomaly detection, preventing bad actors, these are seen as non-competitive, much more collaborative spaces. And that's why if you see what Brad said, that particular applications of Gen AI or AI are more driven there, because people are more willing to share information in that space. There is another challenge I want to put about it. We talk about Gen AI as ChatGPT on our phones and whatever. That's a public data model. For Gen AI to really work in a business context, we need to worry about marrying the public data models with verified, or how do you say, authenticated business data, and that's private. So we'll still have that little bit of barrier or hump to cross on how do we train models on public data. So there was a lot of work happening at Swift on how we do what we call as federated learning. And I think probably we could chat about it next time. We could get our experts to speak about federated learning, where we're trying to preserve the privacy of the data that you own, yet extract learning from the data and try and reapply in other data sets that are, without actually transferring private data sets or private data points from one data set to another. So there is a lot of work that's happening, and yes, and there's no difference between Asia versus the US or any part of the world, because it's very early in the hype curve. Everybody is excited. So and then the nuanced business cases will come later.
I think what ChatGPT has done for this discussion is like immensely. It's going to be called that Uber moment, what they did for UX, for AI, because suddenly everybody knows how to use it. We're having a theme next week on Gen AI and quantum computing. So we just marry those two new greenfield, which I think is something we're going to hear more about in the next SIBOS. So what would you like to hear? This is the final question. What would you like the discussion to be next year? What are the themes that you really want to see in 12 months that we have good conversations about at SIBOS in China? Shirish,
so I can go back to my now and new. I'll go back to my now and new. I think ISO should be a success conversation next time we speak. At least closer to higher adoption and making sure that people understand why it is important and business cases are fleshed out. I would also put in the new pre-validation in a little more mature manner, because that's there. And I would think AI matures into probably a good business case for us to talk about. These are my now and new conversations for the next SIBOS or the next 12-18 months.
I love that. That's two of the topics that we have for next year. So maybe I will do my SIBOS speaking debut if I can scatter up something good over the next 12 months. So, Brad, what would you like to see? And audience, maybe you could do in the chat. Maybe you can put some topics over the last minute there, what you would like to see at SIBOS in 2024, while Brad gives his answer.
Look, I think not too far off what Shirish was saying. I think that, again, what is the experience that we've had with these new services and these new technologies? So how are we actually making progress? So I think the prepayment validation service holds enormous promise for the industry, and how is that being used? I think that's one thing. I think, how have we progressed in terms of cross-border payments and in terms of meeting the G20 goals? I mean, that was a theme, but a lot of it was just sort of setting out the targets and, getting into the more kind of practical side of it, and how are we actually achieving those goals? I think that's and I think that's going to be a strong discussion. Circling back on CBDCs is going to be very interesting. So I think those are kind of the cluster of issues that I'm kind of looking forward to. And also I think, and this came through this sort of my last sort of observation, that there was a lot of positivity around what's happening in the Asia Pacific region. I think a lot of the delegates from North America and Europe were looking quite at what was happening in Asia Pacific and saying, you folks are really pushing ahead and really getting stuff done. So I think there's an ability to showcase some of that in Beijing in 2024, and to say, look, there's a few different ways. There's a little tips and traps here, in terms of actually getting industry to collaborate better, and in terms of actually pushing ahead on some of these issues. Because I feel some of these jurisdictions, are stuck, right? In Europe or North America, they're feeling a little bit, they're in a cul-de-sac. So how do you break through? And I think Asia Pacific provides a lot of opportunities for that. And I think SIBOS and SWIFT will really help drive that conversation.
Yeah. A great location to showcase the innovation in our region. On that note, I think we've come to full hour. So thank you very, very much. Thank you, audience, for listening. We will share the recording. I got that question from many, and you will also find it on our YouTube channel, in our newsletter. And this has been fantastic. I could have gone on for another hour. I still have lots of topics I want to pick on, but I feel we are at the beginning of a journey. It's still lots to be done, but I think we have found a few topics where we sit very well positioned to do impact in our region and globally. So, Shirish, thank you very much for your continued support. Brad, I'm very glad to have you on the team. Audience, let us know if you want us to cover some other topics in the future. So thank you very much for now.
Thank you for hosting us.
Camilla.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Cheers.